Dick Turpin, Money or Your Life, title unfiltered. The Brockley Outlaw, Smokey's hometown in southeast London. Stand and deliver. Your money or your life. These words conjure up images of a dashing highwayman, masked and mysterious, astride a powerful black horse. For many, this is the image of Dick Turpin, the legendary rogue, immortalized in song by Adamant, who sang, Dick Turpin, the highwayman. He was the dandy of the shadows, the star of the night. But was this romantic figure the real Dick Turpin? Or was the truth something far darker, far more brutal? Today, we're peeling back the mask to uncover the raw, uncut story of one of history's most infamous criminals. Born in 1705 in Hempstead, Essex, Richard Turpin's early life was far from the glamorous legend. He wasn't born into aristocracy or forced into a life of crime by noble tragedy. His father was a butcher and an innkeeper, and young Richard followed in his footsteps, training as a butcher himself. But he soon found that illegal activities paid better. He started out by stealing cattle, a common crime back then. He joined a gang of deer poachers, and this is where his criminal career really began to escalate. This group, known as the Gregory Gang, quickly moved beyond poaching. They weren't just stealing from the rich to give to the poor. They were ruthless home invaders. Imagine this, a group of men, faces blackened with soot, breaking into isolated farmhouses in the dead of night. They didn't just take valuables. They terrorized the inhabitants. There are horrifying accounts of them torturing people for information. In one infamous incident, they reportedly held an elderly woman over a fire until she revealed where she'd hidden her savings. This was the world Dick Turpin inhabited. He wasn't a gentleman thief, he was a violent thug. So, how did this brutal home invader become the dashing highwayman of legend? Well, after the Gregory Gang was broken up by the authorities, with many of its members captured and executed, Turpin went on the run. He needed a new line of work, and highway robbery was it. He teamed up with another notorious highwayman, Tom King, who was ironically known as the Gentleman Highwayman. Together, they haunted the roads around London, particularly Epping Forest. This is where the legend begins to take shape. They would hide among the trees, waiting for wealthy coaches to pass. Then, bursting from the shadows, they'd stop the carriage with the terrifying demand for money. Turpin was armed, of course. His pistols weren't just props. They were tools of intimidation and violence. Imagine a pair of heavy, ornate flintlock pistols, the kind you'd see in a museum gleaming in the moonlight as he pointed them at terrified travelers. Now, let's talk about his connection to South London. While his main stomping ground was north of the Thames, the tendrils of his criminal network and reputation reached across the city. Areas like Brockley and Crofton Park, which were then just small villages and patches of woodland on the outskirts of London, would have been the kind of place a fugitive might lie low, or a highwayman might look for an easy target on a lonely road. He was certainly one of the most feared criminals of his time. And if you were to rank the most notorious figures from South London's criminal history, Turpin would undoubtedly be near the top, even if his most famous exploits were elsewhere. His very name struck fear into the hearts of Londoners everywhere. One of the more surprising connections in Turpin's story is to a much more respectable historical figure, Samuel Pepys. Now, Pepys, the famous diarist, died just before Turpin was born, so they never met. However, the world Pepys documented in his diary are London recovering from plague and fire, with bustling streets, political intrigue. And a very real and present danger of crime was the world that shaped Dick Turpin. The social conditions, the vast gap between rich and poor, and the unpolished roads that Pepys wrote about created the perfect environment for highwaymen to thrive. The lonely roads Pepys travelled were the same roads Turpin would later terrorise. But back to Turpin's career. His partnership with Tom King came to a dramatic and tragic end. During a botched robbery or an attempt to capture them, Turpin tried to shoot a constable. But in the chaos, he accidentally shot and killed his partner, Tom King. Once again, Turpin was alone and on the run. This is where the most famous part of his legend comes into play, the epic ride to York on his trusty steed, Black Bess. The story goes that after shooting King, Turpin leaped onto Black Bess and rode an astonishing 200 miles from London to York in a single day to establish an alibi. It's a fantastic tale of endurance and loyalty between a man and his horse. The image is iconic. Turpin, a lone figure silhouetted against the dawn, pushing his magnificent black stallion to its absolute limit, the horse's breath steaming in the cold air, its muscles straining with every stride, until it collapses and dies of exhaustion upon reaching York. It's a powerful, cinematic moment. There's just one problem. It never happened. The story of the ride to York was actually attributed to another highwayman, John Swift Nick Nevison, decades earlier. The tale was later hijacked and attached to Turpin in an 1834 novel by Harrison. Ainsworth called Rookwood. It was this book, this piece of fiction, that cemented the romantic image of Dick Turpin in the public imagination. The novel was a bestseller, and suddenly, the violent thug was transformed into a folk hero. The real Dick Turpin never owned a horse named Black Bess, and he certainly didn't make that legendary ride. The reality of Turpin's end was far less glamorous. After the death of Tom King, he fled north and tried to lie low. He adopted an alias, John Palmer, and set himself up as a horse trader in Yorkshire. For a while, it worked. He lived a seemingly respectable life. But his violent temper was his undoing. He got into a public argument and foolishly shot his landlord's rooster in the street. This seemingly minor act of cruelty and arrogance led to his arrest for disturbing the peace. While in custody, authorities started to get suspicious of this John Palmer. They began investigating his past, especially his knack for acquiring horses that weren't exactly his. The pieces of the puzzle started to come together. The final nail in his coffin came from a letter he wrote from his prison cell to his brother-in-law. Turpin, ever the cheapskate, refused to pay the postage. The letter ended up at the local post office, where, by a stroke of incredible bad luck, the postmaster happened to be a man who had taught Turpin how to write back in Essex. He recognized the handwriting instantly. The game was up. Richard Turpin, alias John Palmer, was it. He was tried for horse theft, a capital offense at the time. Interestingly, he was never tried for his more violent crimes, like robbery or murder, but stealing horses was enough to seal his fate. On April 7, 1739, Dick Turpin was taken to the gallows in York, but even in death, he played the part of the showman. He wasn't dragged to his execution kicking and screaming. Instead, he bought a new set of clothes and hired mourners to follow his cart. He bowed to the crowds that had gathered to watch him die, acting more like a celebrity than a condemned man. He chatted with the executioner, and, after about half an hour on the gallows, he threw himself off the ladder, ensuring a quick end. He was 33 years old. So, who was the real Dick Turpin? He was not the dashing hero of legend. He was a poacher, a brutal home invader, a horse thief, and a killer. He was a product of a harsh and often lawless time. The romantic myth was largely the creation of a novelist nearly a century after his death, but the myth is powerful. It speaks to a love of rebellion, of the lone figure fighting against the system, even if that system was just a wealthy merchant in a carriage. The unfiltered truth is that Dick Turpin was a nasty piece of work. A desperate and dangerous man whose fame far outstripped his actual achievements. Yet, the legend of the dandy highwayman, the star of the night, lives on. It's a testament to the power of a good story and how fiction can sometimes become more real than the truth. Thanks for watching. If you found this dive into the dark side of history interesting, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to Smokey's Niche channel. And subscribe for more raw and uncut stories from the past. See you next time.